My stepmom used to call me the extra mouth. My dad said I was just passing through. Back in 2015, I was 25. Living in a rusted trailer park on the edge of Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the streetlights flickered like they were too tired to keep shining. The air always smelled like diesel and dust. Inside our trailer, the heat barely worked, and the wallpaper peeled away from the corners. Every sound carried through those thin walls. Every sigh. Every argument. Dad spent most of his days on the couch, the TV humming in front of him. Robert Cole, once a mechanic, now a man who seemed allergic to hope. After he lost his job at the plant, he'd drink cheap beer and watch the Weather Channel like it held the answers. Linda, his second wife, smoked menthols by the sink, tapping her nails against the counter while the ashtray filled up beside her. She never missed a chance to remind me how much of a burden I was. Dinner was always quiet. The only noise came from the forks scraping the chipped plates. One night she pushed the plate toward me and said without looking up, "You should be thankful for what you get." Extra mouth. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and ate in silence. Dad glanced at me, then back at his food. He didn't defend me. He never did. Marcus sat between them. My half-brother, 10 years old, skinny and quiet. He'd stare at me sometimes, maybe wondering why I stayed. He didn't know I was wondering the same thing. After dinner, I washed the dishes, listening to the two of them arguing in the other room. Something about money. Something about me. I heard my name. Then the slam of a door. I looked out the small kitchen window. The neighbor's dog barked at the shadows. Somewhere a train horn cut through the night. I dried my hands and grabbed my jacket. The walk to the gas station took 15 minutes. The night shift started at 11. Midwest fuel stop sat off Route 66, next to a closed diner with a broken neon sign that used to say Eats, but now just blinked EA. The store lights buzzed overhead. I clocked in, nodded to the day clerk heading out, and started restocking the shelves. Working nights wasn't so bad. It was quiet. Sometimes too quiet. I'd sweep the floor, check the pumps, stare out at the empty highway. Truckers came and went. Faces lit by dashboard lights. Buying coffee, yerky, cigarettes. Most never looked up when I spoke. People like that live in motion. I felt stuck in place. Around 2 in the morning, I'd sit behind the counter and open my old laptop. It was slow. Keys worn down. Battery taped together. But it worked. I'd take the free Wi-Fi and pull up the online class I'd saved for weeks to afford. Supply chain fundamentals. Not exactly a dream subject. But I thought maybe if I learned how things moved, I could find a way out of this place. Sometimes a customer would come in and break my focus. A drunk college kid asking for gas. A woman needing directions. A cop grabbing coffee. When it was quiet again, I'd go back to my notes. Logistics. Distribution. Optimization. The words sounded too big for a guy sitting behind a counter at 2 in the morning. But they made sense to me. One night, I came home just as the sun was coming up. Linda was waiting at the kitchen table. Smoke curling from her cigarette. She flicked the ash. Eyes sharp. "I saw your laptop. You think you're gonna be something with that? Dreams don't pay rent." I dropped my bag by the door. "Maybe someday they will." She laughed. This short, bitter sound. Robert came out from the bedroom, rubbing his face. "What's going on now?" "Your son thinks he's going to college online," she said. "Like that's gonna fix anything." He looked at me. "You can't live in that screen forever. Ethan, the world's real out here. Don't forget that." I met his eyes for a moment. Maybe that's the problem. "Dad, maybe this is too real." He shook his head. Don't get your hopes up. Boy. I wanted to say something back. Something sharp that would make him feel what I felt. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The morning air was cold. The sky just starting to turn gray. I walked to the edge of the trailer park and looked down the road toward the highway. Cars passed in the distance. Going somewhere better. I thought about the class. About the notes on my laptop. About how every night I learned something new that nobody cared about but me. Maybe that was enough for now. The next night at work, I poured myself a cup of stale coffee and stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. I opened a new document and typed, "One day, I'll build something that lasts." I read the sentence a few times, then saved the file. Out on the highway, a truck engine roared to life, the sound fading into the distance. I looked up through the window at the dark sky. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was passing through. Not yet. Anyway, the next morning, the air felt heavier than usual, like the sky was holding its breath. I left the trailer early, walked to the gas station, and watched the sun climb up behind the rows of rusted roofs. Every house looked the same. Same dented pickup. Same sagging porch, steps. Same tired people waiting for a reason to move. At the station, I brewed a pot of cheap coffee and started another long shift. The radio played static between songs. The hum of the coolers filling the silence. Around noon, a delivery truck pulled in. The driver complaining about routes and dispatchers and how no one knew what they were doing anymore. I nodded, half listening, half thinking about how I'd fix it if I could. When he left, I wrote in my notebook, "Late shipments happen because no one tracks what really matters." That night I walked home past the edge of the trailer park. The wind was sharp, carrying the smell of burning trash from somewhere down the street. When I reached our place, the lights were on. I could hear Linda's voice before I opened the door. She was angry about something. Her words sharp and fast. Inside, she stood by the counter with her arms crossed. Robert sat slumped in his chair, eyes on the floor. I didn't even have to ask. She said the money from her purse was missing. $80. I told her I hadn't touched it. She smiled in that way that made my stomach tighten. "Sure," she said, "because money just walks away on its own." I looked at my father. He didn't look back. Linda tapped her cigarette on the table. Maybe it's time he learns to take care of himself. Robert finally met my eyes. "Pack your things," he said quietly. "You can't stay here if there's trouble." I waited for him to change his mind, to see what was happening. But he didn't. So I nodded. Fine. In my room I packed what little I had. A duffel bag. Some clothes. The old laptop. Half a notebook. And Marcus's lighter. The kid knocked on my door before I finished. He held out a folded piece of paper and said, "Mom's lying. Don't go." I smiled and ruffled his hair. "Someday, you'll understand." Kid. Outside, the air was cold enough to burn my throat. I stood for a moment, looking at the small window where I'd spent so many nights, staring at the dark. The curtains moved. Maybe it was Marcus watching. Maybe it was nothing. I walked out of Rusty Acres with the bag over my shoulder, my boots crunching the gravel. The highway lights shimmered in the distance, like a promise I didn't believe in yet. For the next few weeks, I lived in a cheap room behind a diner off Route 51. The wallpaper smelled of grease, and the heat rattled louder than the trucks outside. The rent was $90 a week, paid in cash. I worked nights and studied when I could, but mostly I stared at the cracked ceiling, wondering how long a man could keep going without a reason. One night, after a 14-hour shift, I came back and found an eviction notice slid under the door. Late rent. I sat on the floor, opened my laptop, and checked the online class. I was 3 lessons behind. I watched anyway. The instructor's voice was calm, steady, talking about efficiency and process. I didn't understand everything, but it felt like progress. When the Wi-Fi cut out, I looked around the room. My notebook was open beside me, half filled with numbers and half with thoughts I'd never say out loud. Maybe dreams didn't pay rent, but at least they didn't lie to me. The next morning, I walked to the gas station and asked for extra shifts. The manager, a tired man named Rick, shrugged. Nights and weekends if you want them. No one else will take them. I took them all. Days bled into nights. Nights into mornings. I barely slept. My hands cracked from the cold. My back ached from standing too long. Sometimes I'd stare at the highway and count the trucks, just to remind myself the world was still moving. One night, around 2 a.m., a stranger walked in. Tall, heavy coat, rough hands. He asked for coffee and a sandwich. We talked for a few minutes, mostly about the weather and work. Before leaving, he looked around and said, "You're wasting away in here." Our kid. I laughed it off, but the words stuck. After he left, I wrote in my notebook again, "There has to be a way out." When I got home that morning, I found Marcus's drawing tucked inside my bag. A small sketch of a truck driving into the sunrise. I didn't remember putting it there. I pinned it to the wall above the desk. Weeks later, I finally saved enough to catch up on rent and buy a used desk chair. It squeaked, but it was mine. I started spending every spare minute working on my app idea. A system to track deliveries in real time. Something simple but useful. I wasn't sure it would ever work, but at least it kept me alive. Sometimes I'd fall asleep at the desk, wake up with the screen still glowing blue. The world outside would be quiet, except for the hum of the diner's freezer. One night, the power went out. The screen died, and the room went black. I sat there, listening to the rain hit the metal roof, and thought about what Linda said. Dreams don't pay rent. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was all a waste. But then I thought about Marcus, about the way he looked at me that night, and about the truck in his drawing, driving toward the light. I lit a cigarette and sat back. The power came back a few minutes later, the laptop screen blinking awake. I opened the file labeled Freight Tracker Demo and started typing again. By sunrise, I had the first rough draft of something that almost worked. My fingers ached. My eyes burned. But I couldn't stop smiling. I looked at the clock. It was time to get ready for another shift. I closed the laptop, grabbed my jacket, and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet asphalt and diesel. For a second, standing there, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I woke up before the alarm. The pale light coming through the blinds. My back ached from sleeping in the chair again. The laptop was still warm on the desk. The cursor blinking on the last line of code I wrote. For a minute, I just sat there, letting the hum of the diner's freezer next door fill the silence. I hadn't felt that kind of satisfaction in years. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The morning shift at the station went by slow. The same drivers. The same tired faces. The same smell of burnt coffee. Between customers, I scribbled ideas in my notebook, trying to figure out how to make the program run faster. I didn't know anyone in tech. I didn't know anyone who even used words like startup or pitch. But I knew what it felt like to be on the ground, watching shipments go wrong because nobody talked to each other. After my shift, I went back to the room, made instant noodles, and opened the laptop again. I had 1 bar of Wi-Fi from the diner. I searched for logistics managers in Texas and sent 10 emails. Maybe 20. Most bounced back or never got opened. I wrote another one anyway. It started with Mr. Miller. My name's Jack Turner. I work nights at a gas station off Route 51. I've been studying supply chain management on Coursera, and I've built a small demo that tracks delivery delays in real time. I just want your opinion. I didn't expect a reply. But I hit send. Then I stared at the inbox until my eyes blurred. Nothing. The next few days were the same. Work. Study. Write. Repeat. The manager, Rick, said I was crazy for pulling double shifts. I told him I needed the money. The truth was, I needed the noise. The motion. When you stop moving, the doubts catch up. 3 nights later, I checked my inbox before heading to work. There it was. One new message. It said, "We don't hire gas station guys." I read it twice, then laughed. It wasn't even signed. Just a name. Frank Miller. Operations Director. Houston Freight Lines. For some reason, it didn't make me angry. It made me want to prove him wrong. I typed back, "That's fine. But maybe you should hire someone who knows what happens when the trucks don't show up." I hit send and went to work. The next few days were quiet. No reply. I started to think maybe he was right. Maybe I was just another nobody in a forgotten town. Then, a week later, at 3 in the morning, I checked my phone during a slow shift. A new email. "Tell me more." That was all it said. 3 words that hit harder than anything I'd read before. I spent the rest of the night putting together everything I had. Charts, mock-ups, spreadsheets, screenshots of my demo. When the sun came up, I sent it off and went to bed. I didn't even notice I'd missed an entire night's sleep. The following week, I checked my phone every hour. Nothing. Then, just as I was closing up the store one morning, a delivery driver came in yelling about a delayed shipment. Something clicked. I grabbed a receipt paper and scribbled a few notes. By the time I made it home, I had the framework for version 2. That evening, I got another email. Frank had questions. Real ones this time. "How do you plan to collect data? How accurate is your tracking?" I answered everything the best I could. He wrote back, "You've got potential, kid." Nobody had ever said that to me before. We kept emailing for weeks. He'd give me feedback. I'd send updates. He never offered money. Never promised anything. But I didn't care. For the first time, someone saw what I was trying to build. At work, Rick noticed the change. "You look different," he said. "Like you're not stuck anymore." I told him maybe I finally had something to work toward. He laughed. "Just don't let it make you crazy." I didn't tell him I was already there. One night, after finishing another long shift, I sat outside the station drinking coffee from a paper cup. The trucks passed by one after another, their headlights cutting through the dark. I thought about my dad. About how he'd look at me like I was wasting my life. Maybe he was right. Or maybe he never knew what it meant to start from nothing. My phone buzzed. Another email from Frank. He wanted to talk. The next day, we spoke on the phone for the first time. His voice was low and tired. The kind that came from too many years on the job. He asked about my background. I told him the truth. I worked at a gas station. I studied online. I didn't have a degree. Just an idea. He was quiet for a while. Then said, "I can't promise anything, but I'll take a look." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Over the next few months, I sent him updates and fixes. Some nights I'd get home after sunrise, sleep a few hours, then get back to work. My rent was late more than once. Rick gave me an advance just to keep me around. I promised him I'd pay him back. Then one night, An email arrived with an attachment. A meeting invite. Houston. Monday morning. 9 a.m. I read it 3 times. It was real. I looked around the small room. The peeling wallpaper. The buzzing light. The cold air leaking through the window. Everything I owned could fit in one duffel bag. I still had Marcus's lighter on the desk. Next to my notebook. I picked it up. Flicked it once. Watched the flame dance. And thought about the road ahead. By sunrise. I had packed my bag and bought a one-way bus ticket. The next morning I stood at the Greyhound station with the bag slung over my shoulder. The bus engine rumbled. Smoke curling from the exhaust. I climbed aboard. Found a seat by the window. And leaned my head against the glass. As Tulsa faded behind me, I saw the sky turning orange over the highway. I thought about the words that had followed me all my life. Just passing through. Maybe this time. I finally was. Houston looked nothing like the pictures I'd seen online. The city felt alive. Heavy with humidity and noise. Glass towers scraping the sky. Cars moving in every direction. I stepped off the bus with my bag slung over one shoulder. My shirt stuck to my back. I didn't know a soul in this place. Frank's office sat in a low industrial park behind a line of warehouses. The sign read Houston Freight Lines. Inside it smelled like paper, coffee, and diesel. The receptionist looked up, surprised when I said I had a meeting with Frank Miller. A few minutes later he appeared. Gray hair, tired eyes. The kind of man who'd been working since before sunrise. "So, you're the kid from Tulsa," he said. I nodded. "That's me." He looked me over like he was still deciding whether I was worth his time. Then motioned for me to follow. His office was small. Messy. Charts pinned to every wall. He sat. Gestured to the chair across from him. "You've got something interesting here," he said, pointing to a printout of my demo. "But ideas are easy. Execution's the hard part." I told him I wasn't afraid of hard work. He smiled. The first real smile I'd seen in months. "Good. Because that's all you'll get here." For the next few weeks, I worked out of the office with no pay. Just a desk near the back. The others barely noticed me. I didn't care. I came early. Stayed late. I learned everything I could. I watched how shipments were tracked. Where mistakes happened. Where things got lost. One guy, Derek Shaw, ran the operations floor. Mid-30s. Expensive watch. Loud voice. He liked to make jokes about my old job. "Careful with that spreadsheet. Tulsa." He'd say, "Don't spill gas on it." I'd just nod and keep typing. At night I'd walk back to a cheap motel off I-10. Work on improving the code until my eyes burned. Frank started checking in more often. Dropping by my desk. Asking questions. "You really built this from scratch?" I told him. "Yes." Every line. He nodded like he didn't quite believe me but wanted to. A month in, he asked if I wanted to join a new team pitching logistics solutions for smaller distributors. It wasn't an offer of money. But it was a start. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The next few weeks felt like my life was finally turning. We presented to clients. Built mock-ups. Stayed in the office past midnight. Frank trusted me more. Even let me lead a demo once. Afterward, he said, "You've got good instincts, Jack. Don't let anyone talk you out of them." For the first time in years, I felt seen. Then everything changed. One Friday afternoon, Frank was out meeting investors. Derek stopped by my desk. He leaned against it, smiling that same smirk. "You've been busy." "Tulsa." He tapped the folder labeled Freight Tracker Pro. Nice name. Mind if I take a look? It's still rough. I said. Not ready yet. He shrugged. Walked away. I didn't think much of it until Monday morning. I walked in and found people gathered in the conference room. Clapping. Derek stood at the front. A slide behind him showing the app's interface. My interface. He called it his. I froze in the doorway. Frank noticed me. Confusion in his eyes. I wanted to speak but couldn't. My mouth went dry. When the meeting ended, Frank pulled me aside. Derek says you helped with some back-end testing. That true? I stared at him. He stole my work. Frank said. Look, Jack. Without documentation, it's your word against his. He's been here longer. You understand. I nodded. Yeah. I understand. I packed my bag that night. Walked out without saying goodbye. Outside, the air felt heavier. The sky threatening rain. I stood in the parking lot, watching the lights from the trucks reflect on the asphalt. Everything I'd worked for. Gone again. I spent that night in a bus terminal. Too broke to rent another room. The next morning I checked my email. Nothing from Frank. Nothing from anyone. By noon, I bought a ticket to Dallas. I didn't know why. Only that I couldn't go back to Tulsa. The ride took 5 hours. I sat by the window, watching the fields blur past, thinking about the word failure and how familiar it had become. When we stopped for a break, I saw my reflection in the glass. I didn't look like the same person anymore. In Dallas, I found a room behind a pawn shop. The rent was cheap. The walls thin. But it was mine. I started picking up delivery jobs through an app. Driving borrowed fans. Hauling boxes for small companies. At night, I worked on rebuilding my software from scratch. Weeks passed. My savings vanished. I stopped answering calls from Tulsa. Marcus had left a few voicemails I couldn't bear to play. The silence between us grew heavy. But I didn't know what to say. One evening, I opened my email and found a new message. It was from Frank. The subject line said, I was wrong. The message was short. I've been watching what you're doing. You were right about everything. Let me make it right. I read it twice before believing it was real. I stared at the screen. The words blurring through tears I didn't expect. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. I wrote back. I don't need an apology. I need a partner who means it. He replied 10 minutes later. You have one. That night I walked outside. The streets still wet from rain. The city lights flickered in puddles. I took a long breath and looked up at the sky. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like it was pressing down on me. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. Frank kept his word. Within a week, he sent a small wire transfer. $10,000. And a message that said, let's build this right this time. It was more money than I had seen in years. Enough to register a company, buy a real laptop, and finally move out of the room behind the pawn shop. I rented a tiny office in an old brick building off Commerce Street in Dallas. It used to be a dry cleaner's. The paint still smelled like bleach. I bought a used desk, a second-hand chair, and a coffee pot that never stopped dripping. I called the new company Midwest Freight Systems. It sounded big, maybe bigger than me. But that was the point. Frank worked from Houston, checking in by phone every night. He sent contacts, advice, small contracts to test the software. I coded until my hands hurt. By the end of that summer, I had 3 clients and enough revenue to pay the bills. The first time I saw a check with the company's name printed on it, I almost laughed. It felt impossible. One night I was locking up when I got a call from Frank. You've got to be careful, he said. Derek's been sniffing around. He knows you're building again. I leaned against the desk. He can sniff all he wants. This time everything's registered under my name. Just stay sharp. Frank said. Guys like him don't forget. He was right. A few weeks later, I was at a trade event downtown, trying to pitch our tracking app to small shippers. I felt out of place in my cheap suit. Then I saw him. Derek Shaw. Same perfect haircut. Same smug grin. He looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. Didn't expect to see you here, he said. I smiled. Yeah. I get that a lot. He laughed softly. Heard you've been busy. Hope you're not still using company material. Everything I've got is mine. I said. He leaned in a little. Good. I'd hate for things to get messy again. He walked away before I could answer. My pulse didn't settle until hours later. A month after that, I received a letter. It was a cease and desist from his lawyer. He claimed Midwest Freight Systems was built on stolen intellectual property. I sat in silence for a long time, the paper trembling in my hands. Then I called Frank. I told you this was coming. He said. What do? We fight. We spent weeks gathering evidence. Every email. Every file. Every timestamp that proved I built the first version long before Derek touched it. It was exhausting. Half of me wanted to give up. But I couldn't. Not again. One evening, after another 12-hour day, I drove out to a truck stop outside Fort Worth. I sat at a corner booth with a coffee. The air thick with the smell of diesel and fried food. Two truckers argued about dispatch errors, about shipments gone missing. I listened quietly, thinking about how all of it could be fixed if my system reached enough people. I wrote on a napkin. Real problems. Real people. Don't stop now. When I got home, I found another letter from Derek's lawyer, this time demanding compensation. I threw it in a drawer. Frank called later that night. His voice calm. We'll take it to court. Let him play his game. You've got the truth. The following months were chaos. I barely slept. Split between keeping clients happy and preparing for depositions. My lawyer, Jake Thompson, a friend of Frank's, told me we had a solid case. But it would be ugly. Derek's people came after everything. They contacted my clients, trying to scare them away. A few canceled their contracts. I watched my account balance drain and wondered how much more I could take. One night, as I sat alone in the office, the lights flickering, I got an email from Marcus. It had been years since I'd heard from him. The message was short. Dad's not doing well. He asks about you sometimes. I stared at it for a long time before closing the laptop. I couldn't go back. Not now. Not while I was fighting to prove I wasn't the same kid who left. Frank visited a week later. The first time we'd met face to face in years. He looked older, but steadier somehow. We went through the case together until midnight. When we finished, he leaned back and said, You ever think about why you keep fighting? Because if I don't, no one will remember who was right. He nodded slowly. Just don't lose yourself trying to win. I thought about that for days. By spring, the court date was set. The office felt emptier than usual. The coffee pot broke. The ceiling leaked when it rained. And the hum of trucks on the nearby freeway was the only sound left. The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep. I drove until the highway turned quiet and the city lights disappeared. I pulled over at an overlook and stepped out. The air was warm. The sky clear. Somewhere far away, a train horn echoed. I thought about Tulsa. About the trailer park. About Linda's voice calling me the extra mouth. Maybe she was right back then, but not anymore. I sat on the hood of the car until dawn, thinking about the boy I used to be and the man I had to be now. When the first light hit the road, I took a deep breath, started the engine, and headed back toward Dallas. Tomorrow I'd walk into that courtroom, look Derek in the eye, and let the truth do what it always does: catch up. The courthouse in Dallas was colder than I expected. The kind of cold that sinks into your hands no matter how tight you clench them. I sat outside the courtroom with Jake Thompson, my lawyer, staring at the polished floors while people rushed past. The noise of footsteps, the hum of voices. It all faded into the background. I kept thinking about the years that led me here, about all the nights I'd stayed awake trying to prove I wasn't who they said I was. Jake leaned over. "Stay calm," he said. "Let the evidence talk. You've got this." Frank sat across the hall, flipping through papers. He looked steady, not nervous like me. When the clerk called our case, we stood. I could feel Derek's eyes on me as we walked inside. He was sitting with his lawyers, all dressed in dark suits, looking smug, confident. It was the same look he'd given me the day he stole my work. The hearing started slow. Derek's attorney talked for nearly an hour, painting me as some desperate ex-employee trying to claim credit for something I never built. He said words like fraud and damages and infringement until they lost their meaning. I sat there, quiet, fists clenched under the table. Then Jake stood. He didn't raise his voice. He just started showing the evidence. Emails, timestamps, code files from my old laptop. The judge leaned forward, squinting at the screen as Jake spoke. Each message told a story. Each line of code a trail back to the nights I spent building something no one believed in. Derek's lawyer objected, saying the files could have been fabricated. That's when Frank asked to take the stand. The room went quiet. He walked up, placed a hand on the Bible, swore in, and said, "Your Honor, I was there when Jack sent me those emails. I ignored him. I doubted him. But that code, that idea, was his from the beginning." For the first time since the trial started, Derek's face shifted, a flicker of panic. I watched his lawyer whisper to him, flipping through notes that suddenly didn't look so solid. The judge asked a few questions, glanced at the documents, then said he'd take time to review. We were dismissed for the day. As I stepped into the hallway, I could finally breathe again. Frank came over, resting a hand on my shoulder. "You did good, kid," he said. "The truth's finally catching up." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through downtown Dallas, the streets quiet under the glow of the streetlights. I thought about all the people who had doubted me, who had told me to stop dreaming. I wasn't angry anymore. I just wanted it to mean something. The next morning, the courthouse was quieter. Derek didn't look at me as we waited for the judge. When the verdict came, it was short. The court finds in favor of the defendant, Jack Turner. All claims dismissed. Case closed. I didn't move. I didn't even smile at first. It felt unreal. Then Jake patted my back. Frank grinned, and the noise of the room came rushing back. Derek walked out without a word. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of victory and emptiness. Outside, reporters waited. I didn't stop for them. I just kept walking until the sound of their questions faded. The air was warm, the sky clear. For once, it felt like the world wasn't pushing against me. When I got back to the office, I sat at my desk, looking at the old coffee stain on the corner. My inbox was filling with messages. Clients wanted to come back. New companies wanted meetings. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. Frank called later that night. "You ready to get to work?" he asked. I laughed. "Yeah, I think I finally am. Over the next few months, business picked up faster than I could have imagined. Midwest Freight Systems went from a name on paper to something real. We hired 3 people. Then 5. A small team. But loyal. Every truck we tracked felt like another piece of proof that the fight had been worth it. One evening, while reviewing shipments, I got a message from Marcus. I hadn't heard from him since his last email. He wrote, "Dad's getting worse. You should come home." I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. I didn't know what to say. "How do you face someone who gave up on you before you even had a chance to start?" I typed a reply. Deleted it. Then closed the laptop. The next weekend, I drove back toward Tulsa. The roads were familiar. The fields. The signs. I passed the old trailer park entrance. The sign for Rusty Acres was still there, but cracked and fading. The park looked smaller, emptier. I didn't stop. I just slowed down enough to see the window of our old trailer. The one where I used to sit awake at night. Somewhere behind those walls. I'd learned how to survive. That was enough. When I got back to Dallas, I felt lighter. I spent the next morning in the office, working with the team on a new update for our system. Frank called around noon. He said investors were interested. Real investors this time. The kind that could take the company national. By the end of that week, we had contracts, meetings, calls. It all blurred together. Success didn't come with fireworks. It came in small moments. Like signing an invoice without worrying if the check would bounce. Or watching my team laugh in the office knowing none of us were alone anymore. One night I stayed late, staring at the company logo on the wall. The hum of the servers filled the silence. I thought about what Frank had said. Don't lose yourself trying to win. Maybe that was what this was about all along. Winning wasn't proving anyone wrong. It was proving that I could keep going no matter who was watching. I packed my things, turned off the lights, and stepped outside. The air was cool. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine roared to life. I smiled to myself. For the first time, I realized I wasn't fighting to survive anymore. I was building something that could last. By the start of 2022, the company was finally stable. The bills were paid on time. The servers ran smooth. And our little team worked like a family. I had an office with a door, a decent chair, and a view of the Dallas skyline through dirty windows. Sometimes I'd look out there and still feel like the kid in the gas station, waiting for something to happen. Frank called every morning to go over numbers. We had new contracts lined up in Kansas City and St. Louis. The app was growing faster than we could keep up with. Every truck we tracked, every route we optimized, felt like another brick in the wall I'd been building since Tulsa. Then one afternoon, I opened my email and saw a subject line that froze me. Shaw Logistics, legal notice. Derek again. I called Frank. He already knew. They're claiming damages. He said. Same song. Different verse. I asked if he thought they had anything new. He said, probably not. But it won't stop them from trying. We hired Jake again. He sounded calmer this time. Almost amused. They're grasping at straws. Jack? Still. We'll handle it right. Keep records clean. Don't lose focus. For the next few months, I split my life between running the company and fighting to protect it. Every email felt like evidence. Every contract, a line of defense. The pressure built slowly. Like a storm you could see coming but couldn't stop. Then one evening, as I was locking up, Frank called. You sitting down, he asked. Derek's company filed for bankruptcy. The lawsuit's smoke. Nothing behind it. I stood there in the dark office. The hum of the servers behind me. trying to let that sink in. Years of chasing me, tearing at my work. And now it was gone. I didn't celebrate. I just turned off the lights and went home. Over the next few weeks, we started seeing real growth. Word spread fast after the case news hit the local press. Investors came calling. One of them, a quiet guy named Richard from Kansas City, offered to fund our expansion into the Midwest. It felt like everything was finally paying off. But success has a way of making you face old ghosts. One Sunday morning, I got a call from Marcus. He said Dad was in bad shape. Liver trouble. The doctor said, "He's asking for you." I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that call. The coffee went cold. I thought about that day in Tulsa. When he told me to pack my things, I thought about all the years I'd worked to prove he was wrong. And now, he wanted to see me. I drove up 2 days later. The road was familiar. The same highway I'd left on 10 years before. Rusty Acres looked smaller now. The sign had faded almost white. The trailers rusted and sinking into the dirt. I parked outside the old lot. Marcus met me at the door. He was taller now, his face sharper. But he had the same quiet eyes. "Mom's gone," he said. "Left years ago. Dad's inside." Robert was sitting in the recliner, blanket over his legs, a bottle of water on the table. He looked older, thinner, like time had taken everything but the guilt in his eyes. When he saw me, he smiled weakly. "Didn't think you'd come." I pulled up a chair. "You asked?" "I came." He nodded, staring at the floor. "You made it. I saw the article about your company. You did good. Son. Better than I ever did." It wasn't pride in his voice. It was regret. The kind that comes too late. We sat in silence for a while, the TV humming in the background. Then he said, "I wasn't a good father. I was scared. Scared you'd turn out like me." I wanted to tell him he had. That for years I'd been running from everything he taught me. But instead, I said, "Maybe you just didn't know how to believe in me." He nodded, eyes wet. "You forgive me." I didn't answer right away. Forgiveness wasn't a word I could say easy. I stood, looked around that small room. The same wallpaper. The same air that once felt like a cage. Finally, I said, "Yeah, Dad, I forgive you." He looked up at me, like he couldn't believe it. "Thank you," he whispered. I left before sunset. Marcus walked me to the car. He asked if I'd come back again. I said I didn't know. The drive back to Dallas felt different. The road seemed shorter, the sky clearer. I didn't feel angry anymore, just empty in a good way, like something heavy had finally lifted. The next morning, Frank was already in the office when I arrived. He handed me a folder. "New contracts," he said. "You ready for the next step?" I looked around the office. The team was laughing in the break room. The coffee pot was full. The hum of the machines was steady and alive. "Yeah," I said. "I'm ready." Later that day, as I stood by the window watching the sun dip behind the skyline, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Marcus. "Dad passed this morning. He asked me to tell you he was proud." I put the phone down and stayed quiet for a while. I didn't cry. I just looked at the horizon. The same direction the trucks were heading. Somewhere out there was the boy I used to be. The one who thought no one would ever believe in him. Maybe he'd finally believe in himself. That night, I locked the office, stepped outside, and listened to the city. The hum of traffic, the distant rumble of trucks, the pulse of life moving forward. I thought about everything I'd lost and everything I'd built. Sometimes, you have to lose almost everything before you understand what it means to start over. I turned toward the parking lot. The lights reflecting off the glass door, with the company name printed in bold letters. Midwest Freight Systems. It wasn't just a name anymore. It was proof. The morning after the funeral, I woke before sunrise, sat in the kitchen, and watched the light come through the blinds. The house was quiet. I made coffee, checked my phone, and tried not to think about Tulsa. But it kept coming back. Everything started there. Every mistake. Every word that pushed me forward. By that fall, the company had grown faster than I could track. We had clients in 6 states, 20 employees, and more work than we could handle. Frank moved up to Dallas to help run operations, and we rented a bigger office downtown. People called us a success story, but to me, it just felt like survival with better furniture. One afternoon, I got an email from a producer at a local news station. She wrote that she had read about Midwest Freight Systems winning a Small Business Innovation Award and wanted to feature the story. I ignored it at first. I wasn't interested in cameras or attention. But Frank said I should do it. People need to hear this. He told me. It's not just about you anymore. A week later, I found myself in a studio under bright lights. The air smelled like makeup and coffee. The anchor, Emily Hayes, smiled and said she liked stories about second chances. She asked about the early days, the gas station shifts, the nights I almost quit. I told her the truth. I said I used to believe success was about proving people wrong. But somewhere along the way, it turned into proving I could keep going when no one believed in me. She nodded, eyes soft. When the segment ended, she said, "That's going to mean something to a lot of people." The next morning, my phone didn't stop buzzing. Emails, messages, calls, friends from years ago, old co-workers, even a few people from Tulsa. The story had aired the night before. I didn't think much of it until Marcus called. Dad saw it. He said. He was quiet the whole time. Afterward, he told me, "Tell your brother I'm proud." I sat at my desk, the noise of the office fading. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. That evening, as the office emptied out, I stayed behind. The city outside glowed in the orange of sunset. I poured myself a cup of coffee and watched trucks roll past on the freeway, their headlights cutting through the haze. Somewhere out there, people were still driving through the night, just like I used to. I thought about Linda, about the way she'd look at me like I was taking up space. I wondered where she'd gone. If she ever turned on the TV that night. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. It didn't matter anymore. Around 8. An email came through from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line said, "Didn't expect to see you there." I opened it. It was from Robert's old account. The message was short. "Didn't expect to see you there. I was wrong about you. I'm proud." Even if I never said it, I stared at the words for a long time, my hand resting on the mouse. There was nothing else to say. No apology I needed. Just that. I closed the laptop and sat back. When I left the office, the night air was cool. I drove until the freeway turned quiet, until the lights of the city disappeared behind me. At a rest stop outside of Denton, I parked and stepped out. The sky was clear, the stars bright. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folded check I had written earlier that week. $20,000 made out to Marcus. The memo line read, "For whatever's left of home." I dropped it in a mailbox near the gas station, the kind that looked like the one where everything had started. Then I stood there for a while, listening to the wind and the faint hum of trucks on the road. It felt like the world had come full circle. Like all those nights working under fluorescent lights had finally led here. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't trying to prove anything. As I drove back toward Dallas, the radio played low. The road stretched out ahead, smooth and endless. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing something. I was finally catching up to it. The next morning, the city was covered in fog, soft and gray, like the world had paused to take a breath. I drove to the office early, parked by the loading dock, and stood there for a moment before unlocking the door. The building was quiet except for the hum of the servers in the back room. The logo on the glass still made me smile every time I saw it. Midwest Freight Systems. 10 years ago, it was just a note in a spiral notebook, written by a kid nobody believed in. Now it was real. Humming. Alive. We had contracts in 12 states and a small team that worked like a family. Frank was already in his office when I walked in, a coffee waiting on my desk. He had that same calm look he always did, like he'd already lived 3 lives and learned how to stay steady through all of them. "Morning," he said. "Big week ahead." "Yeah," I said. "They all are." By noon, we had a meeting with new investors. They wanted to expand into the West Coast. I let Frank do most of the talking while I watched the trucks move on the tracking screen. Each blinking dot meant people working, moving, living. It felt strange knowing all of this started with one man trying to stay awake through another graveyard shift. Later that afternoon, Marcus stopped by. He looked older now, confident, wearing a shirt with the company logo. He'd been helping with fleet coordination part-time. When he walked in, I felt something settle. He asked how things were going, and I told him good. Better than good. We talked about Dad for a while. Marcus said he still visited the grave sometimes. He asked if I wanted to come next time. "Maybe," I said. "Someday." He nodded and didn't press. Before he left, he said, "You did it. You know, you made it out." I told him I didn't make it out. I built something worth staying for. He smiled, said he'd see me at the end of the week, and left. The rest of the day moved slow. The office emptied out. The phones stopped ringing, and the light outside turned orange. I sat at my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out the old notebook I had kept all these years. The edges were torn, the pages yellow. Inside, on the first page, was the line I had written more than a decade ago. "One day, I'll build something that lasts." I traced the words with my thumb and closed the book. Outside, the last trucks were leaving the loading dock, their taillights glowing red in the dusk. I turned off the lights and walked out to the parking lot. The sky had cleared, the stars starting to show. The air smelled faintly of rain. I sat on the hood of my car for a minute, just listening. Somewhere far off, a train whistle echoed. Funny thing about time, I thought, it always tells the truth. They said I was just passing through. Turns out I was building something that would last. I looked up at the office windows. The faint glow of lights left on inside. The hum of machines that would keep running through the night. It wasn't just a company anymore. It was proof that every mile, every sleepless night, every word that cut deep had meant something. People like me, the ones who start at the bottom. We don't dream about revenge. We dream about freedom. The kind that comes when you finally realize you don't owe anyone an explanation. I stood, unlocked the car, and slid behind the wheel. The headlights came on, cutting through the dark. As I pulled onto the road, the city opened ahead of me, wide and bright. If you've ever been called the extra mouth, if anyone's ever told you that you were just passing through, remember this. Every small step counts. Every sleepless night means something. Keep showing up. You're not just passing through. You're building your legacy.